dialogue organized by the Institute for Governance Reform, Center for Accountability and the Rule of Law, and funded by Irish Aid. And we're here this evening to witness a presentation of 3 papers that have been developed by IGR and CAL. But to set the context, setting the pace as to what prompted the conduct of these reports. Like I mentioned, these reports have been funded by Irish Aid, and we have the ambassador here, and we have different stakeholders from the relevant fields that are going to respond to the presentations that will be done by the team that did the reports. But we want to officially welcome all of you. And this is AYV, SIBC, and Star TV. Also, you're listening to us on Afro Radio nationwide. My name is Samuel Wise Bangura. I shall be introducing the speakers when it's their time to talk, because we have to save time. And this program lasts for 1 hour and 30 minutes. So we're going straight off to the Irish ambassador to actually tell us why exactly they decided to fund this particular project. Leslie is here with us. Leslie, good evening. So you're definitely going to you're going to start the ball rolling by just giving us a baseline as to why you are here and why you made that decision to put this in. I don't know, is there something I'm missing? Yes, go ahead, please.
Because of the mask, you don't know, it's not necessary.
Oh, okay. All right. Forgive me. So Andrew, you're going to set the pace then. You're going to set the pace and give us a baseline as to why we're here this evening, Andrew.
Thank you very much. So I don't know whether we've already played the recording.
No.
So thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here. Yeah, too often. Yesterday, I think it was last week, we sent out, mistakenly sent out a flyer saying that over 60 countries have deferred elections because of COVID, and there was, a big uproar. Why should we be saying that? But we think it's useful for us to monitor what is happening. COVID has brought quite a lot of restiveness to countries around the world. It will be important for us to pay attention to what is happening as a way of mitigating the effects of such pandemic on institutions of governance. We understand that many institutions are under threat right now, so it will be useful as a responsible country to understand what is happening and try to see how you can mitigate that. But let me just start by introducing who is here. We have Mr. Albert Masakoi. Albert is representing the National Elections Watch, National Electoral Commission, and we have Mr. Langoba Kelly. Langoba Kelly is the Director of Planning at the Office of National Security, and we have Dr. Emmanuel Gaima. Emmanuel Gaima is I refer to him as my mentor, so to speak. So he is the governance advisor at State House. So I thank you very much for gracing this occasion. And we have from the Ministry of Gender, Mr. Charles Lahai, Charles Vandy. Charles Vandy is a guru in gender. When the minister said she will not be attending, and I said, but why? You're a woman, you should be here. He said, it's even appropriate for us to bring a man to give a gender perspective. I think that would be better understood. I think I have Commissioner Victor Lansana from the Human Rights Commission. My colleagues are here. I'm seeing Evans, I think, around the table. So we have our donors here, the Irish Aid. The two of them are here to grace the occasion. Unfortunately, the ambassador is not in. But Josephus is really, in many respects, I can say, is the brain behind this project. And when Josephus contacted us about doing something around responding to COVID, what can we do about governance institutions? How do we track governance in a way that supports institutions to respond better? So we were kind of taken aback as where the idea was coming from, but we responded and we bounced ideas to and fro. That's why we're here. So thank you very much, Irish Aid, for joining us. So I think the reason why we're here today is to present the three reports. The three reports, there's one looking at the EMBs, and definitely when we introduce any research topic, the background of that research will be introduced. So that's why we're here. I understand representative from the Sierra Leone Police will be joining us very soon. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you. And so now we have to quickly move to the presentations. And so we would have to first look at Sierra Leone's response to COVID-19, implications for human rights, livelihoods, and governance. And that particular presentation will be done for us by Mr. Ibrahim Tomi, who is Executive Director for Center for Accountability and the Rule of Law. Ibrahim Tomi.
Thank you very much, Samuel. And I'd like to start by once again thanking the Irish Aid through the Embassy in Sierra Leone for supporting this initiative. It's a huge opportunity for us as human rights defenders to be part of this response, because oftentimes when there's a public health crisis of this nature, we only thinking about how do we limit the spread of the virus, how do we save lives. Sometimes we do not really care even about livelihood, and clearly the basic human rights issues that all of us should be interested in. So our intervention in this initiative was basically to keep tabs on how the COVID response measures were being implemented, and whether indeed there was respect for human rights, and indeed the implications of those response measures for livelihood, good governance, and certainly the health of our country. So the report, in my presentation, will focus briefly on what the report is about, the methodology, and certainly the limitations, some of the key findings, and yes, the recommendations that we have made. So essentially, the report examines the government's response to the COVID-19 public health crisis and its implications for human rights, livelihood, and governance in Sierra Leone. I think that's really critical for us. It also provides an overview of human rights violations, but more importantly, the lack of accountability for those alleged violations, and certainly talks about some of the livelihood and governance issues threatened by some of the COVID response measures. As I said, we have also preferred some recommendations, but also we should point out that as the response wore on, we saw some improvement in terms of even, the handling of the crisis by security forces, and also government made some interventions to cushion the serious livelihood implications that some of the measures had. In terms of methodology, basically what we did was to review national and international human rights instruments, our constitutions, the various human rights standards that Sierra Leone has signed up to. We also looked at some of the measures going from the declaration of state of emergency, the emergency measures regulations that were introduced. We also used our monitors across the country to collect data, and we have also relied on data by like-minded institutions, credible institutions, regarding human rights violations across the country, especially since the state of public emergency was declared by His Excellency 2020. We also had a chance to interview some witnesses, obviously victims, and then we had some focus group discussions, of course, with regard to all the COVID measures. Unfortunately, in terms of limitations, we couldn't capture data on social economic impact of the COVID preventative measures because, obviously, of the restrictions and the time constraints that we had in putting this together. So I'd like to rush quickly and go through the findings. The key findings, let's be clear about this, that emergency situations may demand certain extraordinary measures, and such measures may include restriction on basic freedoms, such as freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, etc. However, it is our position, and I think it is a standard position, that those restrictions must be narrowly construed so as not to unduly impede fundamental human rights. But our conclusion is that given the scale and the nature and scale of the threat posed by the virus, most of the restrictions that were introduced certainly made sense. They were necessary given the threat posed by the virus. However, the fact that they were necessary doesn't excuse some of the violations, or many of the violations, perhaps all of the violations that we witnessed and which we have catalogued in this report. Certainly we observed a number of significant rights abuses by authorities, especially security forces. We saw security forces beating up people deemed to have violated stay-at-home orders. Petty traders who were deemed to have violated curfew lost their wares. Their wares were sometimes confiscated and carted away by security personnel. People were arrested, detained sometimes for more than 24 hours without any charges being preferred. The courts were shut down at some point, so access to justice was clearly a major issue. But more importantly, there was lack of investigation and certainly prosecution for some of those alleged violations. In Freetown, during one of the lockdown, the stay-at-home orders, we saw police personnel beating up people who went out to fetch water, for example. And there was this inter-district lockdown, which certainly affected businesses. So it had, whilst the restrictions, as I've said, was not essentially a violation, but some of it had implications for livelihood. So businesses were affected, people couldn't afford food, access to water. All of those issues constituted a major issue. For example, in terms of accountability, financial accountability, at one point we saw the Accountant General stepping in to audit the funds. There was some resistance. Fortunately, in the end, the audit was done, but again, as I've said before, we realized that there was some progress. At some point, the police got better, and government introduced a lot of sort of intervention, pushing the economic impact on the people. So basically, we're recommending three key things for the government of Sierra Leone. That first, government should ensure that a common sense approach be adopted and ensure that available scientific and medical information is used in its response, and that it should provide additional support, especially to low-income earners, and ensure that there is justice for all in the fight against COVID. But finally, there's a recommendation targeted at CSOs. I think CSOs have to do a bit more to enhance social mobilization and ensure that conspiracy theories, in particular, that undermine uptake of vaccines are defeated. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Barrister Ibrahim Tomi, for that presentation. We've listened to the presentation, and definitely there are concerns, and but those concerns, I'm pretty sure we're taking note of the concerns we have, and the questions that will be coming to respond to those issues that have been raised from the presentations that week. So I think we have to move to the second presentation, just so we save time, and then we come to the concerns and the issues raised, so that the relevant authorities can address and speak to those concerns. And now we have to move to the second presentation, which is political parties, COVID-19, and women's political participation by Dr. Fredlyn Mokumok-Hill. Here you are, ma'am.
Thank you. Again, good evening, and thank you to Irish Aid, and thank you to you all for being here. So this, what we did here was piggybacking a bit on Tommy's presentation. We looked at COVID-19 and the implications on women. We've all heard that COVID-19 has been seen to disproportionately impact women. We know that in Sierra Leone, women have been vulnerable to the disease as primary caregivers within their families. We also know that concerns have been raised about the rise of sexual gender-based violence, as we've seen in other countries, particularly during lockdowns. And many have argued that women, if you really want to make a difference, women need to have a seat at the table. And yet we see that often they're very much absent from the policy and from the institutions. In Sierra Leone, we also know that the numbers of women in leadership is very low. So given the importance that's been placed on having women represented in leadership, and women's unique vulnerabilities, the purpose of this research was to look at women's leadership in Sierra Leone to understand the barriers and the opportunities that face women when it comes to political representation. There are 3 areas that we focused on when we looked at vulnerability. 1, we spotlight COVID and SGBV. 2, we looked at what women have done in terms of COVID so far in the response informally. And 3rd, we look at the opportunities and constraints to women's political leadership, focusing on the delegate selection processes. And we look at this because often when we talk about women in politics, we look at the end part, women who are being elected as parliamentarians. But what happens in the delegate recruitment process? This is key also because if women are absent from these spheres, that can have implications on the numbers of women elected. We our research methodology, we had a nationwide survey to 1,936 citizens between May and June. We conducted 138 key informant interviews. We did KIIs in Bo, Kenema, Moyamba, Potloka, and Tonkolili. And then we also had interviews with 14 of the 18 female parliamentarians. First, let me talk about COVID and SGBV. Whilst overall it looks like people were asked about their perception about whether SGBV is taking place, people in general said that it had gone down in the year during COVID, but there were some key issues that people did feel had increased, and the 4 most prevalent types of SGBV were emotional or psychological violence, wife beating, sexual penetration, and rape. You also had FGC that was mentioned is still taking place in communities. Importantly, we had 13% of respondents say that they knew of somebody who had experienced SGBV, but only 15% said that they knew about the 116 line, which is the toll-free number to report these cases. And given the mobility restrictions of COVID-19, having widespread knowledge about this, we believe, is key. The second issue, women and leadership in the COVID response, we saw that even though women are not formally included, so for example, within most of the response pillars in NACAVEC are headed by men, only one of the DMOs is female, and only one of the district coordinators of DICOVEX is headed by a woman. So women really aren't very present in the response, but we did see that very informally women were leading. So the majority of key informants that we spoke to, mostly women, party leaders, said they conducted sensitization around COVID, infection prevention awareness, social mobilization, advocacy, and generally spreading knowledge about the disease. Just to give you a flavor of what women said, one said, we showed leadership in so many ways. We were going in and out of this constituency to talk to women as to how to prevent themselves from getting the sickness. We were even going into the Bundu bushes to talk to Soris to stop FGM practices because it can undermine the fight. Another said, we found out that women can lead better in other countries. We are soft-hearted people. We easily feel sorry for everybody, including men. If we're in a leadership position, we can do better than men. So then the third part is women in formal political leadership. And as I've said, we don't have, we had 12% when it comes to women in politics. And this has been an issue that's been raised by many EMBs about the need to increase women's representation. But before women can compete for these positions, they first have to receive the party's nomination. You need to get votes by delegates who, through various processes, are either elected or selected by the party. So this was the process that we focused on to see to what extent are women able to access these positions. We noted differences in the processes. For the SLPP, the process is largely election, whereas APC is a combination of election and selection. Nevertheless, irrespective of which method was used, we saw that women face serious constraints. In terms of the criteria for selection, it seemed quite clear. Women mentioned that you need to have a party card, you need to be a vibrant member of the party, you need to be popular within your communities and have support. But in practice, these are not necessarily implemented. And we see that women either do not run in large numbers, or even those that do run end up not winning. Why? A couple of reasons were given. One, a big one, is that women said, men do not give us a chance to take these leadership positions. APC female party leader said, our male executive leaders are making it very difficult for us to fully participate in politics in this part of the country. They don't allow us to fully participate. They micromanage us. They control us in every aspect of our political activities. Another said, the party does not want women in the delegate positions. If a woman decides to aspire, the party executives will not give their support to that aspirant. And then another talked about violence. A number of the respondents talked about the use of violence as well as deceptive electoral practices to keep them out. One woman said, the party has some certain groups who consider themselves to be the owner of the party. If they see any extra person want to contest for a position, these men can insult us publicly, molest us, mistreat us with so many things. Women talked about how they were given the wrong time for elections, and so when they would mobilize their supporters, the election had already taken place, or they were told to come, the elections would be conducted at the wrong time. Another issue that came up was finances. Women talked about how to become a delegate, you need to spend money to acquire supporters, that women lacked money to buy these delegates, as well as associated campaign costs. One woman said, for example, when a poor woman contests against a wealthy person, it would be very difficult for the poor woman to contest. In our constituency, we have 80 delegates. If a wealthy person brought 60 of them with 1 million for each delegate, that would be the end. And then finally, men and a couple of successful women talked about how women lack the confidence. So these are not new reasons. We've seen these types of things before. What are the implications for our work and the implications for those of us who are here? We saw in the research that citizens do want measures to be taken. 87% of respondents said they wanted parties to adopt measures to increase women's representation. The measures that they discussed included removing nomination fees for women, provision of the 30% quota, and support for women protection from violence. Key informants echoed many of these things. One key informant said, we need a quota of at least 30% in party leadership roles. We need to encourage more women to come forward. For a start, allocate certain executive roles for women to contest only outside the women leader and deputy roles. So moving beyond just quotas, but having quotas at the leadership level was mentioned. Another was greater sensitization. The party must have a robust campaign to encourage women to aspire and be voted for. This was another key informant. Third, somebody else said, we need less violence from various parties. This is one of the reasons why women don't want to be involved in leadership positions. So in terms of the recommendations that come from this, one, as at the start of the presentation, I mentioned the low rates of knowledge about the line for reporting on SGBV. So there needs to be a sustained public campaign to increase awareness of this line, particularly given COVID restrictions. Women need to be able to easily access help for SGBV, both at the reporting level and the service level. Second is provision of quotas and safe seats. Again, this is not new, but rather than just focusing on quotas at the level of the Constitution, consideration of quotas at the level of the political parties as well. Right now, parties have policies. Most of the women did not even know that the parties had policies, and those that did had contradictory things to say about what the policy stated. So we need to popularize those parties at the same time as working with the political parties to implement these quotas within their constitution. The quotas also need to be comprehensive, mandating parties to have more females in leadership positions across the various institutional organs. There also was discussion about the need for safe seats for women, particularly in party strongholds. A second recommendation is to strengthen PPRC and next regulatory powers. At present, given the violence that's taking place, not just in national elections, but at this delegate level, there needs to be some efforts made to ensure that elections are monitored, regulated, and are made safe for women. There needs to be steps towards empowering PPRC to monitor, regulate, and enforce quotas, as well as safe seats. And there should be greater enforcement of existing party codes of conduct. What are the ramifications for non-compliance? A third reason is financing women's electability. So we mentioned that finances was an issue. Steps should be taken to make politics more affordable for women. This can include providing discounts, paying or waiving nomination and candidature fees, having a separate election fund for women candidates, as well as helping women to be financially independent through projects that can sustain them. We also need to address the role of money in campaigning and the buying of delegates. And then finally, there is room to continue the confidence building, the development types, training and empowerment programs that currently exist for women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mukmukil, thank you very much for that presentation. Political parties, COVID-19 and women's political participation. And so we then have to now have the final presentation from the Secretary Director for the Institute for Governance Reform, IGR, and mitigating the effect of COVID-19 on Sierra Leone's 2023 election, self-scoring by elections management bodies. Andrew Lavalley.
Thank you very much. Ideally, this presentation would have been done by the EMBs themselves, because they actually they did the self-scoring. So permit me to do this on your behalf. So what I'll be presenting to you is done in partnership with NEC PPRC ONS, the Independent Police Complaints Board, the SLP, the Judiciary, and the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and then the National Elections Watch. So thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to distill this information which we'll present. At the risk of not repeating what Fredlin and Carla and Ibrahim have all eloquently said, I will just restrict myself to 4 slides. So why are we tracking COVID on our institutions? I think I've said this in the intro, that COVID brought about some governance adjustments. So we saw the state of emergency and the implications for human rights, and then institutional effectiveness. And Fredlin has spoken quite a lot about the implications for that on vulnerable groups, especially women. We've also seen, and it's good to note this over and again, that we've seen many countries postpone elections. So we don't want that to happen. And there is a fear, because following the 2018 elections, we had the International Elections Observer missions that gave a number of recommendations, which all the EMBs have been working on. So what is the implication of that leg of work for COVID? So EMBs need resources. There are implications that elections could be delayed. So what are the issues that we should be aware of? So what we decided doing is to track these adjustments, not only to understand their implications, but to ensure that they are better managed and their effects are being mitigated, so that governance becomes, runs as smooth as possible. So in terms of the scorecard, we looked at 10 indicators of the scorecard, and each indicator has sub-indicators. So there are 50 sub-indicators and 10 major indicators. I don't want to bore you with the sub-indicators. But the sources of the indicators were first and foremost from the election management, election observer mission recommendations, and then the EMBs have their own priorities. ONS, NEC, they have their own priorities, which form part of the 50 sub-indicators. We realized that some of the election management, election observer mission recommendations are already in the works by the various EMBs. Some are already factored in the strategic plans. But we noted that most of these recommendations will require legal reforms. In fact, just this afternoon we spoke to the National Electoral Commission. He said he's in Parliament, I think, trying to push some of these reforms. So in terms of process, to develop this scorecard was jointly developed by the various EMBs, and there are 3-pronged approaches that was used. So first there was an institutional self-assessment, and then the scorecard had 3-pronged approaches. First is how the institution scores itself, and then second is how the institution allows others to score the institution that is doing the scoring, and then thirdly there is an independent scoring that was done. And we want to thank the National Elections Watch that made itself available to do the independent scoring. So what we did, the numbers we'll be sharing with you will be the average of the self-scoring by the institution and then the shadow scoring that was done by a partner institution within the EMB family, and then the expert scoring. So I'll just share with you the indicators. So some of the indicators, the 10 indicators are integrity, participation, lawfulness, impartiality and fairness, security, independence of the EMBs, professionalism, their level of transparency, timeliness and regularities, and then acceptance. So you can see the rating being ranked between 1 to 10, with 1 being the lowest, which is no action has been taken to all of the 50 indicators, and 10 ensuring that all of the actions regarding that particular sub-indicator has been met. So here's the overall result. For the overall result, I think the EMBs were able to say that COVID will have little or no effect on the 2023 elections. COVID will have little or no effect on the 2023 elections. And the second big one, which is to say, if they try to quantify that, 67%, they said there is 67% progress in meeting all 50 indicators addressed in the scorecard. For the self-scoring, the EMBs scored themselves at a level of 70%, which means, given the COVID context, they are 70% assured that election will go ahead as planned. But others scored the EMBs highly, which was very interesting. Others scored the EMBs 73%, but the experts scored the EMBs lower. The experts scored the EMBs 61%. So when you put all three together, it was 67% average score. What were the things to worry about, and what are the things to celebrate in the scoring? 3 things that can be celebrated are the ones on acceptance, and I just refer listeners to the report. There's a detailed report that will look at all of the sub-indicators. Acceptance, transparency, and professionalism received the highest score, and the lowest score were the rule of law and participation. So why the rule of law, why participation? Participation has about 6 indicators, and there are 4 bad scores in the 6 indicators on participation. I don't want to repeat what Frelin has just said, but you can see indicator 7 saying adequate process to ensure that at least 30% nomination of women is in place. The EMBs are saying that we haven't done that much. It is 2.9 out of 10. That's the score. Nomination fees being realistic and affordable for the participation of less privileged groups. They are saying 2.9% over 10, 3 over 10, that's 30%. So I think what the EMBs are saying largely mirrors what Frelin presented, and of course what Ibrahim presented, because at the brunt of human rights abuses, we find women, and at the brunt of all of these governance adjustments resulting from COVID, we find vulnerable groups. So what I will conclude with by way of recommendation is to look at some of these key areas that have not been addressed. One, we saw the security outfit being neutral, which scored below 60%. Security outfit being neutral in providing election security, it scored below 60%. EMBs being equipped to ensure commitment to the relevant code of ethics for campaigns, it scored below just 50%. The provision of resources for EMBs to be timely and adequate is just a little below 50%, but the worst scores were those relating to women, which is nomination fees and adequate process to ensure that the 30% nomination is in place. So I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Andrew?
From Nigeria, thank you very much. So the 3 presentations have been done, and now we're going to ask the relevant authorities from the different institutions attached to the concerns, the areas that have been dealt with by the presenters. We're going to start off with the presentation that was done by Pastor Ibrahim Tomi, on Sierra Leone's response to COVID-19 implications for human rights, livelihoods, and governance. So he mentioned during his presentation that the containment measures that were being instituted during the implementation exercise, first the measures are in place, they were in place, but the implementation, we saw human rights abuses. And during the presentation, what came out clearly was the lack of accountability. People were not held accountable for those human rights abuses. The security sector were, some of the personnel were responsible for perpetrating those human rights abuses. And we have the Deputy Human Rights Chairperson here, Victor Islands, and the police is also represented. So we're going to listen to you with regards to the presentation done by Ibrahim Tomi, the human rights abuses that occurred during the lockdowns, the restrictions, and all of that. What did you capture, or what will you do with regards to the recommendations that he mentioned? So we're going to get you to respond to that. Yes. Sorry? Yes, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Samuel. And on behalf of the Human Rights Commission of Sierra Leone, we are grateful to IGR and Carl for inviting us to this very important program. For us, human rights lives no matter the time, no matter the circumstances, whether it's during a pandemic or what have you, human rights always survives. So yes, there could be some validation to what Mr. Tony presented in terms of the high-handedness of security officers during the COVID-19, with specific reference to the 3 lockdowns. So remember that there were lockdowns when the COVID was actually heightened. But then when we observed, we normally follow social media, we monitor social media, mainstream media. When we saw social media being awash with several concerns from the public in terms of how security officers were actually handling the situation, we had to intervene. We went to monitor the situation. We are all over the country, east, west, north, and south, to ensure that the security officers were actually accountable. Yes, I would concede that indeed, with the first lockdown, there was a very serious challenge in terms of the applicability of the COVID-19 regulations. But then when we intervened, we brought out a report and also even a press release. With that report, we are now better placed to engage the relevant stakeholders. We engage the police, the military, and show them several videos and video footages where their personnel were actually manhandling citizens. So we followed them up on that, and we were very much very strong in ensuring that they did not continue with such very inhuman behavior, because, like I've said, for us, the Human Rights Commission, no matter the situation, we have what we call non-derogable rights. Those rights should always be protected and respected. The rights to life, the rights from freedom of, the rights from torture, those rights that actually have to do with human dignity and so on and so forth. So it doesn't matter whether a pandemic is raging, no matter the magnitude, but those rights should always be protected. So we engage them, we show them the relevant laws, and mind you, Sierra Leone is actually a state party to several conventions, international conventions, for example, the ICCPR, which is very, very clear on these rights. So with our intervention, we realized that the police, the military personnel, they were very much more professional compared to the first lockdown. The subsequent lockdowns were actually much more better handled. So we are really grateful that they listened to our recommendations. And some police officers and military personnel who misbehaved during the first lockdown, some of them were actually called to order by the authorities through our interventions. So going forward, we believe that it doesn't matter the situation. Government always, and government through its various agencies, always has to ensure that human rights are respected no matter what. Because we are all human beings. By virtue of the fact that we are all human beings to be protected and respected. And it is the obligation of government to protect, promote, and fulfill human rights.
So, I mean, we are very grateful that IGR, CAL, and other very serious human rights institutions are coming on board, because we believe as a commission that we cannot do the work alone. So that is why we normally collaborate with these institutions to ensure that government is held accountable, and that is what we continue to do. Thank God we have the advisor here from State House. He will take these recommendations and discuss that at another level. But we are grateful that institutions actually came on board, I mean, from the human rights perspective, to ensure that the security forces generally are accountable for their actions. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much,
Victor. Before getting the side of the Sierra Leone Police, we have the Director of Planning from the Office of National Security, the body that is charged to coordinate the activities of security sector. Now, I stand to be corrected, but I'm sure, Mr. Kali, you also chair the Elections Committee. So you're in place to actually respond to the concerns that have been raised by Mr. Tommy from the reports.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carl and the others who actually put the report together. I think the report itself is an eye-opener. I mean, we are not contending with the findings. We are also not oblivious of the fact that under such circumstances you might have, some high-handedness, but there are most times isolated incidences. And I think you also got to look at the institutional standpoint, on some of these misgivings that have occurred. Because even from the inception of these emergency regulations, they were coordinated by an integrated approach under the auspices of the National Security Council Coordinating Group. So policy directives were always given. Though it's the police that have the remit to operationalize these activities, we also brought in the military under the aegis of MACA, which is military to civil authority, to work in tandem with the police. But also suffice it to know that during such emergencies, the magnitude of the outbreak that we had, was actually relative novelty to us when you consider the magnitude of it. It's not like Ebola, but this one actually, the magnitude permeated the entire fabric of the Sierra Leone society. And those regulations that were put in place, of course, initially, we had some hiccups that we might own up. We went through the contents of the report. But going forward, you might notice, as I rightly been stated by the Human Rights Commission, we took stock of some of those misgivings from the first lockdown, some of those misgivings that we had, and we put in corrective measures in place. So if you notice, subsequently, when we came to institute some of those emergency regulations again, we were able to develop a standard operating procedure for the management of checkpoints, for the management of quarantine homes. There are standards that are attendant to that. So it does not only led to the primary security forces, but there are policy regulations that were developed. So going forward, you saw, of course, improvements as far as the service delivery were concerned. But let's also note that for some of those recommendations, I also noticed that there are a lot of resource implications also attached to that. And for some of those resources, in the absence of some of those resources, we are hamstrung in implementing some of those recommendations that we came up with. But of course, going forward in totality, we'll ensure that the subsequent engagements will take note of all the recommendations that we've come up with, and in developing future standard operating procedures for our engagements. All of those will be highlighted and will be taken on board in terms of implementation. But in totality, we are not oblivious of our findings. We are attuned to them, and we take note of the recommendations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Let's now listen to the Deputy Inspector General of Police, and let's see what does the police have to say with regards to this finding.
Thank you very much. I just want to add my voice to my colleague to say thank you very much to Carl and my brother Tommy for that research. I believe it's going to help us quite a lot in terms of planning. We are not containing what you have said, like my colleagues rightly said. And like I said, in terms of, we have different level of response. When it comes to, we have this polite request, wherein you can ask somebody to actually, engage and make sure that he or she does the right thing. But like I said, there are times you have to come up with, in terms of enforcement, especially we are really in a very difficult situation wherein we have the regulations and we have the responsibility to enforce them. And we all know that, what quite apart from police high-handedness, even with the members of the community we are dealing with, some people know that the regulations are there, but they still refuse to adhere to those situations. But from all indication, that should not actually warrant the police to be very high-handedness. There are other mechanisms you can actually redress such situation. So we actually accept what you have said wholeheartedly. And since the first lockdown, there were a whole series of problems in terms of human rights abuse, high-handedness of the police. But what we actually did as an organization, we are actually getting that report. And we are expecting members of the public. There's a complaint mechanism in place, and we are really expecting members of, if you say police has violated my human rights, we expect you to channel your report through lay down structure. But that did not actually come out well, except for a few cases. But when it came to the second lockdown, after our engagement with our officers, lots of memos were sent out, and we also have series of engagements with our officers, how they can actually deal with members of the public. So initially there was lots of improvement, in terms of enforcement. And quite recently, we have discussed at NACOVAC, even in as much as, we have the mandate to enforce, I think NACOVAC should also come with structures, complaint mechanism, where within the NACOVAC structure itself, they should have complaint mechanism. I think somebody did, I don't know whether it was, Yes, you did a presentation. I'm happy because during that presentation you are very much specific about just the police, but it was an integrated approach to our NACOVAC response or COVID response. So we have recommended that within the NACOVAC structure we can even have a structure in place that members of the public, in case there is any human rights violation, they can channel the report through those structures. So we wholeheartedly appreciate the research and the recommendations. I want to assure you that we will go further to discuss it at our executive management board meetings, so that at least we can continue to engage our men and even have the CDID in place. Because when we deploy, now that we have the curfew, we are trying to enforce the regulations. We've even mandated the complaint discipline internal investigation department to be part of the deployments, so that they can actually monitor what is happening on the ground, so that at least we can actually make sure that we contain our men and women who are deployed during this crucial time. So once more, my brother, thank you very much. Thank you very much. We know the concerns, and we'll make sure that at least where we have gone short, we'll make sure that we address those gaps.
All right. Thank you very much. Madam Lisbeth, we've heard from the Deputy Inspector General, and I think it's a welcome news that the report has not been denied. It has not, the facts in the report being presented are all being accepted, and their efforts, the commitment that they will look into those findings. And so we now have to move quickly to the presentation done by Fredley from that deals with, she speaks about COVID and SGBV, women and COVID, women and political leadership. So three areas, and the things she highlighted in her presentation, of course, the fact that there are people who thought that SGBV reduced, but emotional and psychological violence increased during the period, especially during the lockdowns and things like that. The fact that the report line, many people did not know about the hotline, which they should have used to report some of these incidents. And women and COVID, there is also a minute number of women in leadership, especially at the district level, the BICOVAC level. We're only seeing, I think, 2 women at that particular level. FGM practices, they went in, spoke to them to stop because it undermines the fight. Women and political leadership, and she said we do not have up to 12%, and so it goes back to party nomination. But we have to set the systems first within the political parties, and the 30% quota must start within the political parties. So we have the the Director of Gender Affairs from the Ministry of Gender and Children's Affairs, Charles Vandy, to quickly respond to some of these things Freddie mentioned.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Let me, on behalf of the Honorable Minister, apologize for her absence from this engagement. But let me also thank IGR and Carl for such initiative with support from Irish Aid. I think it has been a learning curve from the findings of this research, and as a ministry, we would appreciate all of the recommendations and the findings that is contained in the report, which will now help us to refine some of the engagements that we are currently embarking on. But just to say, I will start with the 116 line. The 116 was actually launched last year. It was meant to be dedicated hotline, which is free on AfriCell, Orange, and QCell, for people to report all SGBV cases and for us to increase reporting and also access to services. But it's a good feedback that we are getting that low level of citizens actually are aware of that particular line and provision. So that will also help us to do further engagement with communities to ensure that we popularize the 116, because it's not only meant for emergency, but it's a number that is coming to stand the test of time that we can continue to use. The second thing also that you mentioned, yes, the restrictions, they have their own wrong ends. The psychological abuse and other things. Some of the men, we had some reports in the office. Some of the men who used to go home after work, hang out somewhere before they go home, and if they have limited time at home, and then with restrictions they have to rush home, spending longer time at home. That also we got some complaints that impacted actually on the household level, where a lot of domestic violence and other things happened. So even in the midst of COVID-19, the family support unit also recorded high level of domestic violence, as the case may be. But this is also something to suggest that we need the 116 to tie up with all of these reporting mechanisms and see which services and where they are being provided. On the issue of the low level of female participation in the entire response, I think you may want to suggest that yes, it's stated too, but then when we went around to the different DCOVACs, you had females in holding some other positions, which actually, like Ibrahim and Andrew stated, some of them were not at the top, but then informally, in also your report, Fredlin, you mentioned that some of them informally, they did a lot in terms of social mobilization, in terms of ensuring safety of their families and the communities. So that is also something that we can continue to expand on, and we'll make also the recommendations to go to NACOVAC. When the pandemic actually happened in Sierra Leone, what the ministry did, the Honorable Minister, we prepared a document as to the gender response to the COVID response in Sierra Leone. We presented 5 slides. That was presented at State House and it was approved. We sent it to NACOVAC just to ensure that gender is mainstreamed in the entire operations of the COVID response. Additionally, we also ensure that we worked with our partners to hire a gender advisor that was based within the NACOVAC decision-making level. And that was also meant to ensure that gender issues were flagged all over. And we also worked with our partners to develop key messages, including the 116, which the DCOVACs were now supposed to roll out. So if anybody had issue with SGBV matters, they were going to use some of those outlets to get those done. On the issue of the wider political participation and recommendations, including the minimum 30% quota, this has been a long journey, but we are getting on it. And I can only inform you that we are in the process of developing a gender equality bill, which will be presented shortly to Cabinet by the Honorable Minister. And some of the basic things we are looking at in that draft bill is going to look at appointive positions by women, is going to look at elective positions by women, is also going to look at issues dealing with access to finance, is also going to look at issues dealing with employment. I know we do not have, like in the civil service cadre, if you are grade 7, be you a female or male, is equal pay. We also want to see where equal training, opportunities, and other things are provided for in that draft bill. So once that goes through, like the statistics that came from the country, everybody supporting a quota system, affirmative action, I think we'll get there. And during this year, International Women's Day, we had the first gentleman who sent a tweet on International Women's Day that before the end of 2021, the affirmative action bill will be at Parliament. So we, as the arm of government dealing with those issues, we are doing our own assignment to ensure that His Excellency's proclamation is coming to fruition. So we also need to understand that the bill is not just coming from nowhere. We have been on this work for long, but there were wide-ranging consultations on the development of the medium-term national development plan, and for which Cluster 5 we spoke about ensuring the affirmative action, increasing women's political participation. We also have developed the Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Policy, which was launched last year, December, by His Excellency the President. So what we are now doing is translating that policy to a legislation. Unlike other institutions that we develop the law and then go back to policy, we already have a policy which we are now looking at, translating it to a bill. And once that law comes to fruition, I am sure the landscape of the political participation of women will change. Finally, let me also mention that that is not going to be the end of the journey. Even when you have the law, there was one human rights officer that was here in Sierra Leone, Benedict Sano, working for UNAMSI, was always questioning where are the women. So we are not just going to stop by the law, we are also going to engage. Because like you mentioned, some of the men said women lack confidence. We are going to engage communities to ensure that we put a lot of energy and resources into preparing these women. So that if you want 30 women, 100 will come forward. It will now be a question of prioritizing. So this is what, as a ministry, we are trying to do. And I think if we get that done, the dynamics of all of these engagements will change. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. But just quickly, I think there are a few, not you, I'm sorry. There are just a few things that we need the governance advisor to come in on, especially with the issue of the lack of financial strength. They don't have money to buy delegates to vote them in, especially if they contest for symbols. And how do we ensure that we mainstream that as a nation, even within the different political parties, we're able to get that done. And us, the guys marginalizing the women, we feel like we're too strong enough, so sometimes it's violence with the cost they made them come out and they cannot withstand the heat. So in terms of advice, where do you come in, Dr. Maragaima?
I want to join the colleagues to congratulate Carl and IGR and from the Irish Aid. I think the question you ask really speaks to the issue of what is the quality of internal democracy of the political parties. And I'm happy an institution like the Irish Aid is here. Too many times, development partners do not want to support political party development. And so political parties in this country tend not to operate as institutions that will have universal standard practices and guidelines. And so you realize when Freddie was presenting about one political party, for example, having a set of mechanisms to get people into positions, another has a different set of mechanisms, and so it has been difficult to get a uniform or universal process. However, one of the things going forward, I think we're hoping that government will support through the reform that is taking place in the PPRC, is that the PPRC, if it succeeds in Parliament to get a new legislation, will have the ability to be much more vigorous with the political parties. For example, agreeing on a checklist of what are the minimum criteria to fulfill to enhance the internal democracies of political party, to make sure that national policies and programs, like Charles is mentioning, the gender empowerment bill that is to go to parliament, the provisions in there are taken on board so that, for example, clusters of women are provided for based on the vulnerabilities that they suffer. Those are issues. On the issue about the money issue, again, that speaks to reform. Once we are able, for example, to get NEC and the PPRC to have what I want to call progressive legislations, then we'll have some very strong voices speak to the issue of political party financing and the use of money in elections. Currently, we know we are weak as a nation in laws in terms of how much you spend. And I remember speaking to somebody in a political arena who says to me, why do you want to check what I spend when you don't give me money? And so, for example, in terms of threshold, in terms of the sources of financing and what you spend and at what level do you spend money, these are things perhaps once we start to legislate around them, political parties will be able to start to learn from them. But that again will not go far enough if we don't have, again, the PPRC having the ability, the authority to enforce. Take, for example, the operations of political parties that are supposed to meet minimum conditions. Currently, they are supposed to have offices across the country. Rightly speaking also, how many of them have offices across the country? They are supposed to have timelines, for example, for their internal democratic processes, like conventions in readiness for general elections. Currently, they are fixing their own timelines and their own calendars, and those who are inconsistent. Some of them might not at all have conventions, for example, to prepare for elections, and the women, for example, and the young people and people with disabilities or special purposes will not have an opportunity. So going forward, it's a hope that by the time government supports the PPRC and the National Electoral Commission to be able to get very responsive bills to go to Parliament, and those are enacted, and I hope the parliamentarians will also be forward-looking to make sure that these bills are passed quickly in the interest of deepening and strengthening our democracy. The women will have a space, I believe, because internal democracy will trust on the political parties, and I think in terms of money in politics, there will be some regulation. Thank you for now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gaina. We then move to the final presentation that was done by Andrew Lavalley. Andrew mentioned a few things, that there are countries all over the world. Some of those countries have postponed their elections due to COVID, and in Sierra Leone there is the fear that because of COVID, the 2023 elections might be postponed. But he also mentioned that the elections management bodies need resources, legal reforms, and he mentioned 10 indicators, of which there are 50 sub-indicators. And but interestingly, they're saying COVID will have little or no effect on the election. So that is progress in itself, where you have about 67% progress in meeting the 50 sub-indicators, and the EMBs assessing themselves at 70%, others assessing the EMBs at 73%, and the experts assessing the EMBs at 67%. So we then now have to listen to the body charged for the responsibility of conducting elections, the National Electoral Commission. So we have Albert Masako, the Director of External Relations.
Thank you very much. I also want to appreciate the efforts made by the researchers. I'm going to predicate my contributions on what you've just highlighted, the issue of little or no effect that COVID-19 will have on the electoral process going forward. That is the reason why the Commission now has its strategic plan 2020-2024. And there is a chapter in that strategic plan that has a timeline. And looking at the electoral laws, the provisions that we have, it is clear that we are going to conduct the elections. Apart from that, some time back, the Commission did electoral risk assessment on COVID, and we were able to ensure that after such assessment, we did some mitigation plan, and from the mitigation plan, we were able to develop procedures with regards the conduct of elections during COVID. And we have a testament to that. This is a guide and advisory conducting elections in the context of COVID for ECONEC, that is Network of Electoral Commissions in the sub-region in West Africa. And it will interest you to note that the lead consultant was once a commissioner, Commissioner Miata French, who was the lead consultant. So having looked at what we had, our plans, and we were able to export such knowledge for us to have this guide for the entire West Africa, that tells you that we don't see any need for a postponement of elections. We have our procedures, and we've been conducting by-elections, even within COVID. And we have very good working relationship with NACOVAC, and since we've been conducting elections, and all of these elections have gone through. But of course, there is this increase in the funding for elections, because if you bring the COVID component, it has increased the issue of the cost for elections, extra activities, the issue of taking care of all of these COVID-related situations, then the issue of vulnerable and the risk groups factors. We have these persons, how we should manage them, which is also very much important, especially during COVID. But if you look at the procedures that we have been able to ensure that we are able to take care of all of these ones. So that is the reason why, emphatically, we've been very much assertive to say that there will be little, virtually probably no effect that COVID will have on the electoral process moving forward. That besides, we have what we refer to as externalities. Now coming to the issue of the fear that some people have about the postponement of elections. Well, generally, people have been talking about elections. Well, we have different public elections. We have presidential elections. We have local council elections, parliamentary elections. We have these externalities, like the issue of census, the issue of civil registration, all of these other externalities. These are other state institutions, the activities of these state institutions, and the results that they would have based upon their actions or activities. If you look at the postponement, there's the very likelihood for local council postponement, and there is already a government policy. So if we talk about postponement within the context of this cycle, the electoral cycle, it is not the presidential. Probably there may be postponement of one set of election, for example, the local council, because there is already a government policy. But as I speak, we still have the laws of Sierra Leone, and according to the laws of Sierra Leone, local council is still going is still going to be conducted in 2022, presidential in 2023. So if there is this talk about postponement, we are not looking at it from that perspective outside of the cycle. But again, looking at the government policy, which is one of our externalities, just as we are thinking about other institutions making preparation, then we should be mindful of such. Moving forward, the issue of recommendations that have been made from various elections observer missions. In total, there are 111 recommendations. 103 were actually accepted by stakeholders about 2 years ago. Of these 100, and then 7 were rejected. 1 was actually undecided, this issue of movement of vehicles on election day. But of the 103 election observer reports, recommendations that were accepted, about 43 directly relate to NEC as an institution. But there are other primary EMBs and associate EMBs, like whether it is the police, the PPIC, they also have their own roles to play with regards some of these recommendations moving forward. We have these recommendations into 2 categories, basically. We have those that go through statutory review or reforms. Then we have those that have some constitutional provisions. We are going to focus on the statutory ones. That is the reason why the Commission, in collaboration with other partners, very soon we shall be convening a national conference on electoral legal reforms. But our focus is going to be on statutory provisions, because if you go further looking at constitutional provisions, then you might have to look at if some of these provisions are within the realm of whether they are rigid clauses, as in there's a particular word for them, entrenched clauses. But our focus is going to look at some of these ones that are not constitutional, for the reason being we don't want to interfere because it becomes more difficult. But if you go further to look at some of the key highlights, we are talking about election day or date. We want to ensure that at the end of the day, this conference is able to address the bill that will emerge from this engagement, the issue of defining who is a public officer and the 12 months period, which is also very much important, the issue of funding for elections. Already there is a pronouncement invariably from a government official about the issue of the NEST fund, that is the National Elections Sustainability Trust Fund, the issue of having a standalone fund that will be in a position to help in pushing that drive, and also the issue of nomination fees. This is not new. Since 2012, the nomination fees, it has always been an issue. Even the last cycle in 2018, there was a proposed bill. It even went to Parliament. On the last day of Parliament, it was thrown out. So that tells you the Commission has been very much active and will still continue in doing that. So moving forward, the Commission will have to engage with its partners, and with regards to the issue of some of these reviews for reforms, all of these things hopefully will be taken into consideration. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Albert, for that. So just quickly, we are now getting the governance advisor to basically just comment, just give us a brief overview of all three presentations that have been done with regards to your role.
Thank you very much. Again, I want to thank colleagues around the table. The issues around human rights, political parties, women and elections are very central to my role. And my role is one of facilitation, to provide some kind of catalytic support to the presidency to ensure that there is a tap on all the critical governance issues in the country. So for example, around the table here, there are issues around legal legislative review, there are issues around constitutional reform, and there are issues around empowerment and participation, inclusivity, etc., etc. These are all things that concerns my role in the presidency. And what has been happening is primarily to provide advisories at various levels in the presidency to make sure that government keeps track of fundamental things that needs to be addressed. For example, the last speaker has been mentioning the issue around the sustainability fund around elections. Yes, probably he was a little guarded. The former Minister of Finance now, the Chief Minister had actually made public pronouncement towards that, and I want to assure that government is working on that and is committed to ensuring that the fund exists. The reason being, it is also important that the issue of elections are about sovereignty. And as a sovereign state, the government must be able to finance its own elections, at least to put substantial resources into the electoral process, so that the sovereignty of the country is not compromised in terms of, for example, dates, in terms of what the citizens have agreed on, in terms of their preferences for the electoral process, etc., etc. He spoke, for example, around the issue of externalities and mentioned the policy. The policy, I guess, he's talking about is the local government policy. Government is of the view that the Local Government Decentralization Act was 2010, was not quite exhaustive, it was not very intensively consultative, and so a new one has been put together. In terms of how that impacts elections, I want to assure this body here that our government is ready to get the bill to Parliament. As and when Parliament passes the bill, definitely whatever hesitation is there, whatever fears are there that the local government elections might be probably undermined because of a new policy will be removed, because the policy has been passed in cabinet. elections might be probably undermined because of a new policy will be removed, because the policy has been passed in cabinet, and the Minister of Local Governments in the next couple of days will make a pronouncement in terms of some concerns that have been expressed by other political parties about the process, but I want to assure us that we'll move along that. In terms of the other activities of the EMDs, he mentioned the issue about the election observer mission reports. This is something that my office is looking at very strongly. We realize that, like he says, there were other actors outside of NEC that had roles to play. So one of the things the current Chief Minister has done is we put that into a tracker, and he has been calling the various and respective entities, the other actors that have substantial role to play at the security sector, in terms of the security arrangements. You have the Ministry of Information and Communication and a whole lot of issues around information and outreach and autonomy and independence of the national broadcaster. You have the Independent Media Commission that also has a role to play in that. So all of these critical active actors have been called around, and there's a tracker now, and they're pushing that. But we have the view that once we get the new legislation or new bill passing into law for NEC, and we have a new bill passing into legislation for PPRC, substantially some of those critical legislative issues will have been addressed. In terms of the constitutional issues that he's saying, yes, all issues that are non-entrenched, I think government will soon make a pronouncement on, and then because government wants to proceed with those. And the other issues that are also entrenched, but probably which have implications for governance, democratic deepening in the country, equally I want to assure this gathering that a very substantive comments were made very shortly, because the Attorney General is hard at work in terms of reaching out and supporting the President to come out with that. So in summary, I want to say that the issue of gender empowerment is very close to the heart of the President, and even last week he was actually pushing and asking questions around when are we having the bill from the Ministry of Gender, because that's a commitment, and one of my roles and the role of the Chief Minister is to make sure that we track the presidential commitments and a pronouncement, and I want to assure that that is top on the agenda and it will be pushed through. There are other issues also probably that we now have spoken to here. There is the issue around the young people and youth empowerment, and youth in politics, and youth in governance. There are also issues around people with special needs or disability and how those ones are going to be actively engaged. These are all issues that are also on the democratic space for discussion, to make sure that come the next election, these people are taken care of. So on the whole, I want to again congratulate my colleagues for this, and I believe this is quite inspirational and supportive, because it opens the eyes, like we said, traditional of government, to see the corners where we could not necessarily see. But this is the kind of role again that's expected of civil society and active development partners to be able to point the direction of what are progressive for our country's democracy. Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you very much. So we are being dangerously chased by time now, and we just have to give each of the presenters 2 minutes to conclude. Benton.
Thank you very much, Sana. I'd like to thank everyone. This has been a very decorous and frank conversation, and we're quite pleased for the frankness with which state actors have approached our report, the findings and recommendations. From our point of view, clearly some progress has been made, or progress has been made in terms of respecting the rights of citizens in the COVID response. But from what we've heard from all the speakers, there's still an accountability gap, and I hope that we'll continue to work with the police, the ONS, to make sure that police officers in particular are held to account for those violations. But one thing that came out of our report and findings that we haven't talked much about is the gap in access to economic and social services. We are a poverty-stricken nation, so some of those measures, as necessary as they are, as we have said, have had serious implications for livelihood issues. Unfortunately, we haven't focused a lot on those, but I'm hoping that moving forward, our measures will obviously reflect the realities, the economic and social realities that we find ourselves. I also like to pick on the DIG's point about complaint mechanisms. I think as CSOs, we need to do a bit more to popularize those mechanisms. But on your part, once those complaints come true, I think it's about providing feedback on your actions, because for people to come to you to file complaints, they've got to have confidence in those mechanisms, that there will be a response and that they will be updated on those responses. That is really critical to ensuring justice and accountability for violations. And I like the fact that you are now deploying CDID personnel along your response officers, because it is really important that the CDID is doing this job. And I think there's also a role for the independent complaints police board. Unfortunately, we haven't invited them here, but they have a role moving forward. And beyond this meeting, of course, we are going to engage a lot more. And this is a report I just wanted people to see. Everyone in this room will get a copy of this report, and of course, other state actors will receive copies of this report. Once again, on behalf of the Center for Accountability and Rule of Law, I'd like to thank everyone, including, of course, our funders, Irish Aid. Without you, this wouldn't have been possible. Thank you, IGL, for leading this partnership. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are moving over to Fredlin.
Thank you so much to all of you for the insightful comments. I'm excited to hear about the progress that is on board for women. I'm praying indeed that we will see its realization, because women have been long on this. I think to your point about the internal democracy of our parties, this is fundamental, especially when we talk about violence, when we talk about the ways in which women are undermined in electoral practices. So I'm hoping that in terms of what NEC will be doing, that there will be some synergies there also, that as we seek to strengthen the electoral, strengthen the internal democracy, we're also looking to see how to regularize some of these, because they're being done without the oversight of NEC. So I know we're
Thank you very much. I will be brief. So I think on behalf of IGR and Carl, the entire partnership, I think your presence here is something that is worthy of special notice. I will say only in Sierra Leone that this happens in compared to many other countries in Africa, for us to have civil society on one end of the table talking with government on critical issues affecting the lives of citizens. We are proud to report that the data we've submitted to you are very high quality. We'll be sharing the reports to you sometime this week, and we'll be having, if on your invitation, I understand the SLP invited us the other day, we'll be having surgeries with at the institutional level to do these individual presentations. It's all good. When we are developing this report, Freddie and I had a number of exchanges about what we call the unwritten rules affecting women. And we'd never had time to actually document what those unwritten rules are. But they will say, have a party card, have this. But what makes a woman not confident to contest for elections? What makes a woman to say, the men do not allow us? There's so much contained in that. I only hope that if we go back home, we reflect on some of these, and then we actually take concrete action. Because if care is not taken, by 2023, we'll have fewer women. We've written the cost of politics. The cost of politics actually detail how much does it take for someone to maintain power. And too often, that is not affordable. So it will be useful to see how some action will be taken. And of course, we're happy to report that from the vibes we are hearing around the table. What we will encourage members of the table from the state partnership is to see how we tie some timeline to some of these. For example, we're talking about the 30% quota. We don't know whether there's a timeline to this. If we have that, I think it will be useful. For the police, the report we published last week, which we shared with the citizens, are saying they do not know complaints procedures. They do not know grievance redress mechanisms. How, if you are violated in the context of COVID, how do you address that? But the same people, 73% of them said, no, we are satisfied with the way the police treated us. I think that is something that we all need to applaud ourselves, but about 25% of them are saying, there are complaints about bribery in the face of crimes committed. So I just want to leave you with those few remarks, largely on the part of the Ministry of Gender to actually consider what those unwritten rules are and how could we engage them moving forward. I want to thank the Irish Aid for this partnership, and I want to believe that it's something that we endure. We will have held this conference in person, but we are where we are. But I think when COVID is over, we will just say that we are not celebrating anything because the challenges are just ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, IGR, Carl, and Irish Aid. And we've come to the end of this particular conference, and we now have to leave our audience, our viewers and our listeners, with the speech from the Irish ambassador, Leslie. So let's enjoy.
So